A poor student's act of kindness echoed through the empty university corridor as Marcus Wellington helped the elderly man who had collapsed against the wall, not knowing this simple gesture would unveil a secret scholarship fund that would change everything. The autumn rain hammered against the windows, matching the persistent rhythm of worry that had dominated Marcus's thoughts for weeks. His threadbare coat, still damp from the morning downpour, clung uncomfortably to his shoulders as he knelt beside the stranger. "Are you all right, sir?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the hollow silence of the otherwise deserted hallway. His last class had ended an hour ago, but he lingered in the library, postponing the long walk home in the storm. Now he was grateful for that decision. The man's eyes, startlingly clear blue against his weathered face, focused slowly on Marcus. "Just need to catch my breath," he wheezed, attempting to straighten himself against the institutional beige wall. Marcus glanced at his watch, 6:47 p.m. His evening shift at the diner started at 7:30, and he still had to cross town. Being late again would cost him his job, and without that income, his already precarious university enrollment would collapse entirely. The final tuition installment loomed just 2 weeks away, a mountain he had no idea how to climb. But something in the old man's dignified struggle stopped Marcus from walking away. "Let me help you to a chair," he offered, carefully supporting the stranger's elbow. The man's tweed jacket felt expensive beneath Marcus's calloused fingers, oddly out of place in this neglected corner of the humanities building. "Thank you, young man," the stranger said, his breathing steadying as Marcus guided him to a wooden bench near the department bulletin board, plastered with outdated flyers for events long past. "I'm not as steady as I once was." Marcus set down his worn backpack, held together more by hope than stitching, and pulled out his half-empty water bottle. "Here," he said, offering it to the man. "It's not much, but it might help." The man accepted with a nod, taking small measured sips. Marcus noticed his hands, liver spotted but steady, with a signet ring that caught the fluorescent light. Hands that had seen decades of work but maintained a certain elegance. "I should probably call someone for you," Marcus suggested, mentally calculating how many minutes he could spare before he absolutely had to leave. The stranger returned the water bottle and waved away the suggestion. "No need. Just a moment of weakness. Happens more often these days." His eyes, sharp now, studied Marcus with unexpected intensity. "You're in quite a hurry." Marcus shifted his weight, torn between responsibility and concern. "I have a shift starting soon, but I want to make sure you're okay first." "A job and studies?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a heavy load." Marcus offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No choice, really." The rain continued its assault outside, creating rivulets down the windows like tears on glass. The building's ancient heating system groaned, fighting against the early November chill with minimal success. "What are you studying?" the stranger asked, seeming in no hurry to move along. "Engineering," Marcus answered, then added with a hint of pride that surprised even himself. "Full scholarship my first 2 years, but it didn't continue." The words felt like admitting defeat, and Marcus immediately regretted sharing so much. The man nodded thoughtfully. "Competitive field, challenging to maintain those academic requirements while working, I imagine?" Marcus's throat tightened. His GPA had slipped just 0.3 of a point after his mother's illness required him to pick up extra shifts. 0.3. The difference between continuing his education and watching his future dissolve like sugar in rain. "I should go," Marcus said abruptly, reaching for his backpack. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" The stranger rose to his feet with unexpected steadiness. "Actually, would you mind walking me to the main entrance?" Still feeling a bit unsteady, Marcus glanced at his watch again. 6:53 p.m. If he ran the entire way to the diner, he might make it. Barely. "Of course," he agreed, knowing he was probably sacrificing his job, but unable to leave the man alone. They walked slowly down the corridor, their footsteps echoing against the linoleum. The man moved deliberately, one hand occasionally brushing the wall for support. "Engineering," the man repeated thoughtfully. "What drew you to it?" Something in his tone, genuine curiosity without judgment, loosened the knot in Marcus's chest. "I want to build things that last," he answered honestly. "My neighborhood's falling apart, infrastructure crumbling, water systems failing. I thought maybe I could come back and make a difference." The dream sounded childish when spoken aloud, but the man nodded as if it made perfect sense. Noble ambition, needed now more than ever. They reached the glass doors of the entrance, where the rain continued its relentless drumming. "Seems I've made you late," the man observed, gesturing to Marcus's watch. Marcus swallowed hard. "It's okay," It wasn't, but what choice did he have? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, offering it to Marcus. Edward Harrington, he introduced himself. I'd like to continue our conversation, perhaps when you're not rushing to work. Would you call my office tomorrow? Marcus accepted the card automatically, glancing down at the embossed lettering. Edward Harrington, Emeritus Professor of Architecture. Below that, an address in the prestigious north side of the city and a phone number. Sure, Marcus replied, tucking the card into his jacket pocket, certain he'd never use it. What could an emeritus professor possibly want with him? Professor Harrington extended his hand. Thank you for your kindness, young man. Not many would have stopped. Marcus shook the offered hand, feeling calluses that belied the man's refined appearance. Anyone would have done the same. No, Harrington said with quiet certainty. Thus, they wouldn't have. With a final nod, he pushed through the doors and stepped out into the rain, moving with a vigor that made Marcus question whether the earlier weakness had been entirely genuine. By the time Marcus reached the diner, soaked and breathless, he was 17 minutes late. The manager, a harried woman named Gloria with permanently furrowed brows, met him at the employee entrance. Third time this month, Wellington, she said, arms crossed over her faded uniform. I told you what would happen. Gloria, please, Marcus pleaded, rainwater dripping from his hair onto the already slick floor. My bus didn't come, and then there was this old man who needed help, and... Gloria raised a hand, stopping his explanation. Save it. I've got a business to run. You're a good worker when you're here, but I need reliability. She handed him a small envelope. 2 weeks' pay. I'm sorry, Marcus. The envelope felt impossibly light in his hand. Much too light to hold the weight of his remaining tuition payment, his rent, his mother's medication. Marcus stood frozen as Gloria walked away, leaving him alone with the sound of rain and the crushing awareness that he had just lost everything. That night, in his cramped apartment, where the radiator clanked but provided little heat, Marcus sat at his second-hand desk, staring at 2 items: Professor Harrington's business card and the tuition bill with its glaring due date. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, the memory of his mother's voice echoing in his head. Pride is a luxury we can't afford, Marcus. Sometimes you have to reach out. The following morning, wearing his only decent shirt, washed in the sink and ironed carefully, Marcus stood outside an imposing limestone building in a neighborhood he rarely visited. Professor Harrington's office was located on the 3rd floor of what appeared to be a converted townhouse, now housing various professional practices. Marcus's finger hovered over the intercom button, doubt crawling through him like a physical illness. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say? Hello, we met yesterday when you were weak in a hallway, and now I've lost my job and can't pay tuition, so... help? The absurdity of it made him step back, ready to retreat. You must be Marcus. The voice startled him. Professor Harrington stood at the entrance, holding the door open, looking remarkably different in the clear morning light. Straight-backed and vigorous, his silver hair neatly combed, his tweed replaced by a charcoal suit that spoke of understated wealth. I was watching for you, the professor explained, gesturing for Marcus to enter. Figured you might change your mind if left too long on the doorstep. Marcus followed him into a lobby with polished hardwood floors and up a curved staircase to the 3rd floor. The professor's office was unexpected. Not the stuffy academic space Marcus had imagined, but a light-filled room with drafting tables, architectural models, and walls covered with blueprints and photographs of buildings. You're still practicing? Marcus asked, unable to hide his surprise as he took in the obvious signs of ongoing work. Emeritus doesn't mean dead, Harrington replied with a wry smile, motioning Marcus toward a leather chair. Just means the university wanted my office space for younger blood. I consult on restoration projects mostly, historical buildings, preservation efforts. Marcus sat gingerly, acutely aware of the contrast between his circumstances and these surroundings. Professor Harrington, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not entirely sure why I'm here. The older man settled into his own chair, studying Marcus with that same penetrating gaze from the day before. First, please call me Edward. And second, you're here because you helped an old man when it cost you something to do so. He leaned forward slightly. You lost your job, didn't you? The direct question caught Marcus off guard. How did you? Your expression when you looked at your watch. The panic wasn't just about being late, it was about consequences. Edward's fingers tapped lightly on his desk. Am I wrong? Marcus exhaled slowly. No, I was fired. And now you're worried about tuition. It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded anyway, heat rising to his face. Was his desperation that transparent? Edward opened a drawer and removed a manila folder, placing it between them. I'd like to tell you about a program I oversee. It's not widely advertised, purposefully so. He opened the folder, revealing documents with the university's letterhead. The Wellington Merit Scholarship. Marcus blinked. Wellington? That's my last name. Yes, Edward agreed mildly. An interesting coincidence. But the look in the professor's eyes suggested it was anything but coincidence. Marcus leaned forward, scanning the document, which outlined a substantial scholarship for engineering students who demonstrated both academic potential and exceptional character. I don't understand, Marcus said, confusion washing over him. I've never heard of this scholarship, and I've applied for every financial aid opportunity at the university. As I said, it's not widely advertised. Edward pushed the folder closer. It's privately funded and rather selective in its recipients. Marcus's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why are you showing me this? Because you're exactly the kind of student this scholarship was designed for. Edward's expression softened slightly. A student with not just the intellect, but the character to use their education for something beyond personal gain. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with an implication Marcus couldn't quite grasp. Sir, Edward, I'm grateful, but this feels... we just met yesterday. How could you possibly know enough about me to make that judgment? A small smile played at the corners of Edward's mouth. Perhaps I'm a good judge of character. Perhaps I've been watching longer than you realize. He stood abruptly, walking to a filing cabinet in the corner. Or perhaps, he continued, his back to Marcus, I knew someone else with your same last name many years ago. Someone who showed me a kindness when I desperately needed it. Marcus's heartbeat quickened. My father? Edward turned, another folder in his hands, older and worn at the edges. Your grandfather, actually. Thomas Wellington. The name sent a jolt through Marcus. His grandfather had died before Marcus was born, existing only in the few photographs his mother kept and the occasional stories she shared. A civil engineer who had worked on municipal projects, a man of principle who had died too young. My grandfather was an engineer too, Marcus said quietly. Yes, Edward placed the second folder on the desk. We worked together briefly in the 1970s. I was a young architect, arrogant and full of theories, but short on practical knowledge. Thomas took me under his wing when others in his position might have seen me as competition. Marcus stared at the folder, afraid to open it, afraid of what connections it might reveal. His mother had never mentioned her father working with anyone named Harrington. There was an incident, Edward continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. A design flaw that I missed, that could have been catastrophic if implemented. Thomas caught it, corrected it quietly, and never spoke of it to anyone. He saved not just the project, but my career before it had truly begun. He gestured to the folder. Open it, if you'd like. With trembling fingers, Marcus lifted the cover. Inside were yellowed blueprints, correspondence, and photographs, including one of two men standing beside a construction site, arms thrown casually over each other's shoulders. One was unmistakably a younger version of Edward. The other, with features Marcus recognized from family photos, must be his grandfather. I don't understand, Marcus said again, though a suspicion was beginning to form. What does this have to do with a scholarship now? Edward reclaimed his seat, folding his hands on the desk. After your grandfather died, I established the scholarship in his memory. The Wellington Merit Scholarship has been helping students for nearly 30 years, quietly with one stipulation, that the recipients never know the true source of the funds or its connection to Thomas. But you're telling me, Marcus pointed out. Yes, Edward acknowledged. I'm breaking my own rule because when I saw you yesterday, saw how much of him is in you, I realized that perhaps the greatest honor to Thomas's memory would be for his own grandson to benefit from his legacy. Marcus felt lightheaded, the room seeming to tilt around him. You're offering me this scholarship? I'm offering you what was always meant to be yours, Edward corrected gently. The fund was established with the hope that someday Thomas's descendants might need it. I've kept tabs on your family over the years from a distance. I knew when you enrolled at the university, knew when you lost your initial scholarship. A flash of indignation cut through Marcus's confusion. You've been watching me? My family. Why not just approach us directly years ago? Edward's expression grew solemn. Because Thomas asked me not to. Before he died, when I tried to repay him for saving my career, he made me promise two things: that I would pay the kindness forward rather than back, and that I would never make his family feel indebted to me. He sighed. I've honored the first promise for decades. Yesterday, I decided to bend the second. Marcus looked down at the documents, at his grandfather's signature beside Edward's on decades-old papers, at the scholarship that bore his family name but had remained hidden from him until now. The implications were overwhelming, not just for his immediate financial crisis, but for everything he thought he knew about his family's history. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, Edward said, sliding a pen across the desk. You sign the acceptance forms. The scholarship covers full tuition, books, and a monthly stipend for living expenses. It continues as long as you maintain a 3.0 GPA, not the 3.7 your previous scholarship demanded. We recognize that working students face additional challenges. The pen felt heavy in Marcus's hand. And what's expected of me in return? That you finish your education? That you use it well? Edward's eyes crinkled at the corners. And perhaps someday, that you continue the tradition Thomas began, of noticing those who need help and providing it without expectation of recognition or repayment. Outside the window, sunlight broke through the clouds that had dominated the sky for days, casting patterns across the blueprints on the walls. Future buildings, future legacies, future lives. Marcus thought of his mother, who had worked double shifts after his father left, who had never spoken of financial help available from her father's past colleague, perhaps never knowing it existed. He thought of his own plans, his dreams of returning to his neighborhood with the skills to rebuild what was crumbling. And he thought of the strange symmetry of it all, how stopping to help an elderly man in a hallway had somehow connected him to a past he barely knew, and a future he had feared was slipping away. I don't know how to thank you, Marcus said finally. Edward shook his head. Don't thank me. This isn't charity, Marcus. It's restoration, connecting something broken back to its foundation. He tapped the folder with Thomas Wellington's name. Your grandfather understood that buildings aren't the only things that need solid foundations. Sometimes people do too. With a steady hand that belied the emotion coursing through him, Marcus signed the documents, accepting not just financial assistance, but a connection to his grandfather he had never expected to find. As winter settled over the university campus, Marcus found himself adjusting to a life dramatically different from the one he'd known just months earlier. The Wellington Merit Scholarship had not only saved his education, but transformed his daily existence. For the first time since starting college, he didn't need to rush from classes to work shifts that stretched late into the night. He had time to study properly, to participate in engineering project groups, even to occasionally join classmates for pizza at the student union. Simple pleasures that had seemed impossible luxuries before. But the greatest change wasn't in his schedule or his bank account. It was in his growing relationship with Edward Harrington, who had transitioned from mysterious benefactor to mentor with a natural ease that sometimes left Marcus marveling at the strange turns life could take. Their Tuesday afternoon meetings in Edward's office became a fixture in Marcus's week. What began as discussions about Marcus's coursework evolved into wide-ranging conversations about architecture, engineering, ethics, and the intersection of design and social responsibility. Edward pushed Marcus's thinking in ways his professors didn't, challenging him to consider not just whether he could build something, but whether he should. The technical aspects are crucial, of course, Edward remarked one afternoon as they reviewed Marcus's midterm project designs. But Thomas always said the most important question wasn't, will it stand? But who will it serve? These glimpses into his grandfather's thinking were precious to Marcus, filling in gaps in his family history that his mother, focused on day-to-day survival after her husband's departure, had never been able to address. Did you ever meet my mother? Marcus asked one day as they shared the lunch Edward routinely ordered from the cafe downstairs. Edward paused, sandwich halfway to his mouth. A few times when she was very young, Thomas brought her to a construction site once. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Fearless little thing, wanted to climb everything. Marcus smiled, recognizing his mother's determination even in this childhood anecdote. She doesn't know about any of this, you know. About the scholarship, about your connection to my grandfather. I assumed as much, Edward acknowledged. Thomas was private about his professional relationships, and after his death, I respected his wishes to keep my assistance in the background. He studied Marcus carefully. Are you planning to tell her? It was a question Marcus had wrestled with daily. His mother had noticed the change in his circumstances, of course. He'd explained it as a newly discovered scholarship opportunity, which wasn't untrue. But he hadn't shared the full story, partly because he was still processing it himself, and partly because he wasn't sure how she would react to learning this connection had existed all along. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me thinks she deserves to know. Another part wonders if it might just make her sad, thinking about all the years she struggled when help was potentially available." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "That's fair. Though I should clarify something, Marcus. I did reach out after Thomas died. Once." Marcus's sandwich froze halfway to his mouth. "You did? Your mother was 19, newly married to your father. I attended Thomas's funeral and afterward offered financial assistance for her education, framing it as a scholarship her father had helped establish." Edward's eyes took on a distant look. "She refused, said she and her new husband were going to make their own way. She had Thomas's pride, that was certain." The revelation settled uncomfortably in Marcus's stomach. His mother had never mentioned this encounter. "And you never tried again? Even after my father left? When things got really tough?" A shadow crossed Edward's face. "By then I'd lost track of your family. Your mother moved several times, changed her name back to Wellington. It wasn't until you applied to the university that you appeared on my radar again." He sighed. "Perhaps I should have tried harder to find her. That's a regret I carry." The admission hung between them, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned connections could fray, that people with the power to help didn't always see the full picture of need. Marcus thought of all the nights his mother had worked double shifts, all the times she'd skip meals so he could eat, all while a resource established in her father's name had existed, untapped. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that when the time is right, I'll tell her, not to cause pain about what might have been, but because she deserves to know about this connection to her father. About his legacy." Edward nodded, something like relief washing over his features. "I think that's wise." As winter gave way to spring, Marcus found himself not just surviving, but thriving academically for the first time since his freshman year. Without the constant pressure of balancing full-time work with his studies, his grades improved dramatically. More importantly, he began to reconnect with the passion for engineering that had driven him to university in the first place. One unseasonably warm April afternoon, Edward suggested they take their usual meeting outside. They walked across the university grounds to a construction site where a new engineering building was taking shape, a project Edward had consulted on during its early phases. "What do you see?" Edward asked as they stood at the perimeter fence, watching workers navigate the skeletal framework of what would someday be a state-of-the-art facility. Marcus studied the site with the trained eye he was developing. Good setback from the existing structures. Sustainable materials. Solar orientation looks optimal. He pointed to the eastern side. "That entrance will catch morning light beautifully." Edward smiled approvingly. "You've developed a good eye. What else?" Marcus looked again, trying to see beyond the technical aspects. Something about the positioning nagged at him. It's set back from the main pathway. Students will have to detour to reach it. "Yes," Edward confirmed. "A design compromise. The original plan had it closer to the central walkway, more accessible to foot traffic, but there were budget constraints." Marcus frowned, watching as a student in a wheelchair navigated around the construction barriers, taking a significantly longer route than walking students. "That detour is going to be especially difficult for students with mobility issues." Edward's eyes lit with interest. "Go on." If they adjusted the pathway instead of the building position, created a slight curve here, Marcus traced the possibility in the air, and widened this section, they could maintain accessibility without compromising the building's footprint. "An elegant solution," Edward noted. "Have you considered that perhaps your interest might lie not just in building new structures, but in improving existing systems? In finding the gaps where people are being left behind?" The question resonated with something Marcus had been feeling throughout his studies, a pull toward the intersection of technical design and human needs. "Actually, I've been thinking about focusing on infrastructure rehabilitation for my senior project, especially in underserved communities." Edward's expression warmed. "Your grandfather would approve. He always said the measure of a society wasn't how impressive its new buildings were, but how well it maintained what already existed, how it cared for the foundations laid by previous generations." As they turned to leave, Edward placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar over the months. "Speaking of foundations, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Something important." They found a bench overlooking the campus quad, where students lounged on the grass enjoying the spring sunshine. Edward seemed suddenly older, more tired than Marcus had seen him before. "I haven't been entirely forthcoming with you, Marcus. he began, his voice carrying a weight that immediately set Marcus on alert. About my health. A cold knot formed in Marcus's stomach. What do you mean? The day we met, my episode in the hallway, wasn't an isolated incident. Edward's hands, usually so steady, showed a slight tremor. I have a heart condition, one that's becoming increasingly problematic. But you've seemed fine all these months. Marcus protested, though even as he said it, he recognized the signs he'd overlooked. The occasional shortness of breath after climbing stairs, the days when their meetings were rescheduled with vague explanations, the gradual reduction in Edward's consulting projects. I've become quite good at managing appearances, Edward said with a wan smile. A necessary skill when one reaches my age and wants to avoid being sidelined. But my doctor has made it clear that I need to take more serious measures now. Surgery? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the distant laughter of students. Yes. Next month. Edward turned to face him directly. Which brings me to what I wanted to discuss. The Wellington Scholarship Fund needs a new administrator, someone who understands its purpose and will honor its principles. The implication hung in the air between them. Marcus shook his head reflexively. Edward, you're going to be fine. The surgery will... Marcus, Edward's tone stopped him. At my age, with my condition, I need to be practical. I've been the sole trustee of this fund for 3 decades. It's time to share that responsibility regardless of what happens with my health. The thought of Edward not recovering was too painful to contemplate. In just months, this man had become more than a benefactor or even a mentor. He had become a connection to a family history Marcus had never fully known, a guide helping him understand not just engineering principles, but the values that had shaped his grandfather's life, and by extension, his own. What would being an administrator involve? Marcus asked finally, accepting that Edward needed him to engage with the reality of the situation rather than deny it. Helping select recipients, managing the investment portfolio that funds the scholarships, ensuring the original vision continues. Edward reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. All the legal details are in here. I've already had my attorney draw up the necessary documents. You wouldn't be alone. There's a financial advisor who helps with the investments, but you would be the one making the final decisions about recipients. Marcus stared at the envelope, understanding the magnitude of what Edward was proposing. I'm still a student. I don't have experience with any of this. Neither did I when Thomas first suggested I establish the fund, Edward countered. What matters isn't experience but intention. Understanding why this fund exists, not just to provide financial assistance, but to recognize and nurture the kind of character Thomas exemplified. A group of engineering students walked past, deep in animated discussion about a project. Marcus watched them, thinking about how many talented young people struggled with the same financial barriers he had faced. How many might abandon their dreams without the kind of intervention the Wellington Scholarship represented? I'd be honored, he said finally, accepting the envelope. But I'm still expecting you to be around to guide me through this for many years. Edward's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. That's the plan. In the weeks leading up to Edward's surgery, Marcus divided his time between his studies and learning everything he could about the scholarship fund. The more he discovered, the more awed he became by the scope of what Edward had built from his initial promise to Thomas Wellington. The fund had helped over 50 students complete their education over 3 decades. Many of the recipients had gone on to significant achievements in their fields, designing public housing projects, improving water systems in developing countries, creating more efficient energy solutions. All of them selected not just for academic promise, but for demonstrated character and commitment to using their skills for public benefit. What struck Marcus most profoundly was how personal the selection process had been. Edward hadn't simply reviewed applications and transcripts from a distance. He had observed potential recipients, sometimes for months, noticing those who showed kindness when they thought no one was watching, who demonstrated integrity when faced with difficult choices, who persisted despite obstacles. Just as he had observed Marcus himself, long before their paths directly crossed. The morning of Edward's surgery arrived with a spring thunderstorm that matched Marcus's turbulent emotions. He had offered to drive Edward to the hospital, but Edward had gently refused, insisting that his neighbor had already arranged to take him. No need for you to miss classes, he'd said during their last meeting. I'll be in capable hands. Instead, they had said their goodbyes in Edward's office the previous afternoon. A meeting that had felt frighteningly final, despite both men's efforts to keep the conversation light and forward-looking. As the hours of Edward's surgery approached and passed, Marcus found it impossible to concentrate on his lectures. He checked his phone constantly, hoping for news from the hospital contact Edward had reluctantly provided. A nurse named Janet who had promised to call when Edward was out of surgery. When his phone finally rang during his afternoon engineering ethics class, Marcus bolted from the room, ignoring his professor's startled look. "Hello?" he answered breathlessly, pressing himself against the hallway wall. "Is this Marcus Wellington?" a female voice asked. "Yes, this is Marcus. Is Edward..." "Mr. Harrington is out of surgery," Janet informed him, her professional tone giving away nothing about the outcome. "He's in recovery now." "And..." Marcus pressed, his free hand clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palm, a slight softening in her voice. "The surgery went as well as could be expected. The next 48 hours will be critical, but the doctor is cautiously optimistic." Cautiously optimistic. Medical language for not out of danger. Marcus closed his eyes, absorbing the partial relief. When can he have visitors? Family only for the next 24 hours, then limited visitors after that, assuming his condition remains stable. The words "family only" stung more than Marcus had expected. Despite the connection they'd formed, despite Edward's trust in him to continue the scholarship legacy, in the eyes of the hospital, he was not family. "I understand," he said, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice. "Could you please tell him when he's conscious that Marcus called and is thinking about him?" "Of course," Janet promised. "Are you family? I don't see you listed on his contacts." Marcus hesitated, the question more complicated than Janet could know. "No," he finally answered. "Just someone who cares about him." The days that followed were among the most difficult of Marcus's life. Without access to visit Edward, he relied on daily calls to Janet for updates, each one offering the same maddeningly vague assurances: stable, resting comfortably, making progress. On the 5th day after surgery, when Marcus made his usual morning call, Janet's tone changed. "Actually, Mr. Harrington has been asking for you. He's been moved out of intensive care, and he's now allowed non-family visitors. Limited visits, 15 minutes maximum." Marcus skipped his morning classes without hesitation, taking the bus across town to the hospital. The sterile corridors and antiseptic smell brought back unwelcome memories of his mother's illness years earlier. The same sense of powerlessness in the face of medical crisis. Room 437 had a partially closed door. Marcus knocked gently, then pushed it open at the weak "Come in" from inside. The sight of Edward in the hospital bed sent a shock through Marcus's system. The vibrant, commanding presence he had come to know looked diminished against the white sheets, hooked to monitors that beeped softly, mapping the rhythm of his compromised heart. His skin had a grayish tinge, and the hospital gown seemed to swallow his frame, making him appear smaller, more fragile. "Marcus," Edward's face brightened with recognition, though the smile he attempted clearly cost him effort. "You came." "Of course I came." Marcus moved to the bedside, fighting the urge to flinch at the IV lines and monitoring equipment. "Ha ha ha ha. How are you feeling?" "Like I've had my chest cracked open and my heart handled by strangers?" Edward replied with a ghost of his usual dry humor, which, as it happens, is exactly what occurred. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed. "They said the surgery went well as could be expected." Edward qualified, his breath slightly labored despite the oxygen cannula, which at my age means I'm still here, still talking, but with a longer recovery ahead than I'd like. They sat in silence for a moment, the beeping monitors a constant reminder of Edward's vulnerability. Marcus noticed a stack of engineering journals on the bedside table. "Light reading?" he asked, gesturing to the journals. Edward's eyes crinkled slightly. "I asked the nurse to bring them from my bag. Thought I might review some articles while I'm trapped here." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "You look tired." "I'm fine," Marcus insisted quickly. "Just been busy with finals coming up." "And worrying about an old man?" Edward suggested, his perceptiveness undiminished by his physical condition. Marcus didn't deny it. "You scared me." "I know. I'm sorry for that." Edward shifted slightly, wincing with the movement. "But it's given me time to think about something important. Something I should have addressed sooner." "What's that?" Edward's expression grew serious. "Your mother. It's time she knew about the scholarship, about my connection to your grandfather. I've respected Thomas's wishes for privacy all these years, but I think he would understand that circumstances have changed." The suggestion caught Marcus off guard. They had discussed telling his mother eventually, but Edward had always seemed content to leave the timing to Marcus. "Why now?" Marcus asked. Edward's gaze drifted to the window, where spring rain streaked the glass. Because life is unpredictable, as my current situation rather dramatically demonstrates. Because some connections shouldn't remain hidden, especially when they represent something good. He looked back at Marcus. And because I think Thomas would want his daughter to know that his legacy has been honored, that the values he lived by continue to make a difference. Marcus thought of his mother, of her quiet strength through years of hardship, of how she had preserved what few memories of Thomas she had to share with her son. She works double shifts on Wednesdays and Thursdays. Sunday would be the best day to talk to her. Sunday, Edward repeated, nodding slightly. Will you bring her here? I think this conversation should happen face to face. The request was simple but monumental. Bringing his mother to meet Edward would irreversibly connect these separate parts of Marcus's life, his past and his present, his family history and his future path. I'll ask her, he promised. I can't guarantee she'll come, but I'll try to explain why it's important. Edward reached out a hand, thinner than Marcus remembered, with a hospital bracelet loose around the wrist, and Marcus took it, surprised by the strength still present in the grip. Thank you, Edward said simply. A nurse appeared in the doorway, tapping her watch to indicate that visiting time was ending. Marcus reluctantly stood, not wanting to leave but understanding the need for Edward to rest. I'll come back tomorrow, he promised, and I'll talk to my mother about Sunday. Edward nodded, already looking exhausted from their brief interaction. One more thing, Marcus, he said as Marcus turned to leave. Check the small drawer in my office desk, the one with the brass key. There's something there for both of you. That evening, using the office key Edward had given him months earlier, Marcus let himself into the familiar space. Without Edward's presence, the room felt different. The silence deeper, the shadows longer as twilight gathered outside the windows. Marcus moved to the desk, finding the small drawer Edward had mentioned. It was locked, but the brass key hung on a hook inside the pencil drawer, just where Edward had said it would be. The drawer contained a single item, a worn leather journal with Thomas Wellington's initials embossed on the cover. Marcus lifted it carefully, feeling as though he was touching a piece of his grandfather directly for the first time. Inside, the journal contained not just Thomas's professional notes, but his personal reflections. Thoughts about projects he worked on, challenges he faced, and most surprisingly, frequent mentions of his family. There were entries about his wife, about his daughter's childhood milestones, about his hopes for her future. And there were entries about Edward Harrington, about their professional relationship that had evolved into friendship, about the mistake Edward had made that Thomas had quietly corrected, about Edward's promise to pay forward the favor someday. The final entries, dated just weeks before Thomas's unexpected death from a heart attack at age 47, included a letter never sent, addressed to Edward but clearly meant for his family to find. Edward, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. We engineers always plan for contingencies, don't we? So here's mine. Look after my family if they need it, but do it the way I would, without fanfare, without creating obligation. Sarah has her mother's pride and her father's stubbornness. She'll want to make her own way. Respect that, but be there in the background, a foundation she can turn to if the structure of her life ever falters. That's what true friends do. They become the hidden support beams that hold up those they care about when the visible columns can no longer bear the weight alone. Marcus closed the journal, tears blurring his vision. His grandfather's voice, pragmatic, caring, forward-thinking, seemed to rise from the pages, bridging the decades that had separated them. This journal was not just a record of Thomas Wellington's thoughts. It was a connection across time, a legacy more personal than any scholarship fund. On Sunday morning, Marcus stood outside his mother's small apartment, the journal tucked carefully in his backpack, his heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. He had told her only that he wanted to introduce her to someone important to his education, someone who had known her father. She had agreed with a curiosity that suggested she had questions of her own. Sarah Wellington opened the door, already dressed for their outing in her best blouse, and the pearl earrings Marcus recognized as having belonged to his grandmother. At 45, she looked older than her years. Life had etched its challenges into the lines around her eyes and mouth. But there was a dignified beauty in her features that hardship had never diminished. "Ready?" she asked, grabbing her purse. "You still haven't told me much about this professor we're meeting." "He's not exactly my professor." Marcus hedged, leading her to the used car he had recently been able to purchase. Another life-changing result of the scholarship's stipend. "He's more of a mentor, and he knew Grandpa Thomas when they worked together. His mother's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a surprise. Dad didn't talk much about his colleagues. She settled into the passenger seat. What's his name again? Edward Harrington. His mother went very still, her hand frozen in the act of fastening her seatbelt. Edward Harrington? She repeated, her voice suddenly tight. The architect? Marcus nodded, watching her reaction carefully. You remember him? She laughed, a short, startled sound. Remember him? He came to Dad's funeral, offered me some scholarship Dad had supposedly helped set up. Her expression clouded. I was young and stupid and proud. Told him we didn't need charity. It wasn't charity, Mom, Marcus said quietly, starting the car. It was a legacy, one that Grandpa Thomas helped create. She turned to stare at him, realization dawning in her eyes. Your scholarship, the one that started this semester. It's connected to this Harrington person, isn't it? It's called the Wellington Merit Scholarship, Marcus confirmed, pulling away from the curb. And it's connected to both of them, to Edward and to Grandpa Thomas. As they drove toward the hospital, Marcus explained everything. How he had met Edward, how the scholarship had been established decades earlier, how it had helped dozens of students while honoring Thomas's memory and values. His mother listened in silence, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally a complex emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. Something between grief and gratitude. All these years, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the car's engine. All those times I struggled to make ends meet, to keep you in school, to pay for everything alone after your father left. And this fund existed? The pain in her voice was exactly what Marcus had feared. Edward lost track of you after you moved and changed back to your maiden name. He tried to find you, but did he? She interrupted, an edge to her question. Did he really try? Or was it easier to just focus on strangers, on students he could help without the messiness of real connection? Marcus had no answer for that. The same question had haunted his own thoughts. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the unspoken tension filling the car. At the hospital, they found Edward sitting up in a chair beside his bed, dressed in a proper button-down shirt despite the hospital setting, his color noticeably improved from Marcus's last visit. When Sarah Wellington walked into the room, Edward's expression transformed. Recognition, wonder, and a profound sadness all crossing his features at once. Sarah, he said softly, starting to rise before thinking better of it. You look so much like your father. She stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, studying the man who represented both a connection to her father and a reminder of all the support she might have had, but didn't. Then, with the directness Marcus had inherited from her, she asked, why didn't you try harder to find us? Edward didn't flinch from the question. Because I made a promise to your father to respect your independence. Because after you refused my initial offer, I believe that's what Thomas would have wanted me to do. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, steady despite his weakened condition. It was the wrong choice, I see that now. I should have found a way to honor both his wish for me to look after you and his understanding of your pride. Sarah moved further into the room, setting her purse on the foot of the hospital bed. You knew my father well enough to establish a scholarship in his name, to carry on his legacy for decades, but not well enough to know he would have wanted his family taken care of first? The directness of her question hung in the air between them. Marcus held his breath, watching the two people who connected him to his past face each other across years of misunderstanding. I knew Thomas well enough to recognize that same directness in you right now. Edward replied with unexpected warmth. He never minced words either. He gestured to the chair beside him. Please, sit. There's something I need to explain. Something about the promise I made to Thomas and how I interpreted it, perhaps wrongly. Sarah hesitated, then took the seat, her posture rigid with the emotional armor she had developed through years of self-reliance. Marcus remained standing, feeling simultaneously central to and separate from the conversation unfolding before him. Edward leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the measured cadence Marcus had come to associate with his most important observations. When Thomas saved my career by quietly correcting my error, he refused any direct repayment. He said, you don't pay back kindness, Edward. You pay it forward. It became a fundamental principle between us. Sarah's expression remained guarded, but she was listening intently. After his death, Edward continued, I established the scholarship as a way to honor that principle, to pay forward his kindness by helping students who showed the same character he had demonstrated. Students who, like Marcus, would stop to help others even when it cost them something to do so. And my family? Sarah asked, the question pointed, but her tone softening slightly. Where did we fit in this grand plan of paying it forward? Edward's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of his still recovering strength failing him. That's where I failed, Sarah. I convinced myself that respecting your independence, your right to make your own way without feeling obligated to me, was what Thomas would have wanted. That keeping the connection to your father's legacy separate from your life was somehow honoring his wishes. He reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, his hand trembling slightly with the effort. Marcus moved quickly to help him, earning a grateful nod. When I met Marcus, Edward continued after taking a sip. When I saw how much of Thomas was in him, not just in his appearance, but in his character, his approach to engineering as a way to help others, I realized I had been wrong. That keeping Thomas's legacy separate from his family wasn't honoring him at all. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He would have wanted us to know, to be part of it. Yes, Edward agreed simply. He would have, and I should have found a way to make that happen, regardless of your initial refusal. That's my failure, and I'm deeply sorry for it. Marcus stepped forward, removing the journal from his backpack. Mom, there's something else. Something Edward kept for all these years. He handed her the leather-bound book. It's Grandpa's journal. His thoughts, his notes, and his words about you. Sarah took the journal with trembling hands, running her fingers over the embossed initials. I didn't know Dad kept a journal. He was a private man, Edward said softly, but he loved you deeply. That shines through on every page where he mentions you. As Sarah opened the journal, beginning to scan the entries with growing emotion, Marcus noticed Edward's color fading, the conversation clearly taxing his limited strength. He moved to the bedside monitor, noting the elevated heart rate with concern. I think we should continue this another time, Marcus suggested gently. Edward needs to rest. Sarah looked up from the journal, noticing Edward's fatigue for the first time. Her expression softened further, medical concern temporarily displacing emotional complexity. Yes, of course. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. No apologies necessary, Edward insisted, though he made no move to stand. This conversation was long overdue, but perhaps we could continue it when I'm released from the hospital next week. There's more I'd like to discuss with both of you, about the future of the Wellington Scholarship, about Thomas's legacy. Sarah closed the journal carefully, holding it against her chest as if protecting a treasure. I'd like that, she said, her voice steadier now. I have many more questions, and I owe you many more answers, Edward acknowledged. As they prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated, then stepped closer to Edward's chair. Thank you, she said quietly, for keeping a part of my father alive all these years. Even if I didn't know about it, even if you made mistakes in how you handled it, thank you for remembering him, for honoring what he believed in. Edward reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to take it. Thomas Wellington was the finest man I ever knew, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And now I've had the privilege of meeting his daughter and grandson, and seeing that his true legacy lives on in both of you. The summer sun cast long, golden shadows across the university campus as Marcus stood at the podium, facing the small gathering assembled for the official renaming ceremony. 3 months had passed since that first meeting between his mother and Edward in the hospital. 3 months of healing, reconciliation, and planning for the future. Edward, now recovered enough to move with only a slight hesitation in his step, sat in the front row beside Sarah. Their initial tense reunion had evolved into a cautious friendship built on their shared connection to Thomas Wellington and their mutual affection for Marcus. The past couldn't be rewritten, but they had found a way to move forward, honoring Thomas's legacy together rather than separately. Thank you all for coming today, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. We're here to officially announce the expansion and renaming of what was previously known as the Wellington Merit Scholarship. He gestured to the unveiled plaque beside him, which now read, the Thomas Wellington Foundation for Engineering Ethics and Innovation. My grandfather, Thomas Wellington, believed that engineering was more than calculations and materials. It was about building structures that served human needs, that improved lives, that stood not just physically, but ethically. The foundation that now bears his full name will continue that vision, expanding beyond scholarships to include mentorship programs, community service initiatives, and research grants focused on ethical engineering solutions for underserved communities. Marcus paused, looking at the faces before him. Edward, whose generosity had maintained Thomas's legacy for decades. His mother, who had found a new connection to her father through this unexpected path. And the small group of past scholarship recipients who had returned for the ceremony, each now successful in their own fields, each carrying forward the values the scholarship had recognized in them. This foundation represents not just financial support for education, but a commitment to the principle my grandfather lived by. That we don't simply pay back kindness, we pay it forward. That we build not just for today, but for generations to come. That the true measure of our work is not what we create, but who benefits from its creation. As Marcus concluded his remarks and the small audience applauded, he felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle had been drawn connecting his past, present, and future. What had begun with a simple act of kindness in a hallway, stopping to help an elderly man who seemed in distress, had unveiled not just a secret scholarship fund, but a family legacy he had never fully known, a purpose that would guide his path forward. Later, as the attendees mingled during the reception, Edward approached Marcus, moving more steadily than he had in months. "Your grandfather would be extraordinarily proud," he said, clasping Marcus's shoulder. "Not just of this foundation, but of the man you've become. I wish I could have known him," Marcus admitted, watching his mother across the room as she spoke animatedly with one of the foundation's board members. "You do know him," Edward countered gently. "Through your mother's stories, through his journal, through the values you demonstrate every day without even realizing it." He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "And now others will know him too, not just as a name on a scholarship, but as the inspiration for something larger, something that will continue to grow and change lives long after we're gone." Marcus nodded, understanding the truth in Edward's words. His grandfather's legacy wasn't contained in a fund or even in a foundation. It lived in the connections between people, in acts of kindness paid forward rather than back, in the recognition that the structures we build, whether physical or metaphorical, are only as valuable as the lives they improve. As twilight settled over the campus, casting the new foundation plaque in soft, golden light, Marcus felt something his grandfather had written in his journal. A sense of purpose that transcended individual achievement, a commitment to using his skills not just for personal success, but for the greater good. A poor student's act of kindness had indeed unveiled a secret scholarship fund. But more importantly, it had revealed the power of connection across generations, the enduring impact of integrity and generosity, and the profound truth that sometimes the most important foundations we build are not made of concrete and steel, but of compassion, courage, and love.